Now, our speaker this evening is Peter Aegis, and the title of his talk is A Malta Family History. Peter lives in Havant, which is in Hampshire, and his Aegis family have been in London for 150 years. He's been doing a lot of family history research over the last 20 years and tells me he's got 50 second cousins living in Malta. His talk will cover such topics as the first Maltese entrepreneur in the City of London, Maltese representatives in London during World War I, nursing in Malta, both in World War I and World War II, first buses in Malta, a Maltese archbishop. Well, it goes on. He's been involved with a Malta senator and government minister, the man behind the Malta Pavilion. He was going to tell you all those things. But before we start, I ask you to mute your microphone during the talk and turn off video if you have a reception problem. Of course, you must unmute yourself when you're invited to ask a question. The talk will last about 45 minutes. Following the talk, there will be an opportunity for questions, but please hold them until the end. No questions during the talk. If you do like to put it online, please use the chat button during the talk. Now, I would like to thank all those who've already donated £5 for this evening's talk, and remind those who have not yet donated that we ask for £5 towards our costs and expenses. This evening, we've agreed to donate 50% of the £5 donation to Din Lakrat Helwa, Malta's equivalent of the National Trust. So that's the donation we will be making to them. This talk will be recorded, as David has told you, and possibly uploaded to our website. Your attendance, therefore, will be taken to assume consent to be potentially included in the recording. So thank you all very much and welcome, and over to you, Peter.
Thank you, Graham. All right, I shall start my... So hopefully everyone can see my screen here. So welcome to this broad sweep of Malta history with reference to my Maltese ancestry, which my wife and I have researched for many years. Our research built on an amazing archive of photos and documents passed on by my Aunt Sue, and also a family history written in the 1950s by great aunt Maro for her grandchildren. I'll just that history was then turned into a substantial book by cousin David Arrigo and published in 2003 as Daughter of an Empire. I worked closely with David at the time to list at the back of the book all the descendants of our great-grandfather, Edward Tancred Aegis. In 2003, that number stood at 303, and with later additions and births, we are now on 417 descendants. And since then, we have researched the family connections extensively, especially during the World War I centenary. And we have discovered many more distant cousins along the way who've helped us to fill the gaps. I run two family Facebook groups, one for Aegis and another for Samut, and I make it my business to welcome newly discovered cousins and friends of the family to these groups. And I make sure everyone knows how they connect and give them an awareness of our intriguing family story. And I've already seen a number of cousins and friends with us this evening, and I'll be mentioning some of you in my talk as I get to that part of the story you have helped me with. And those of you familiar with the Maltese pronunciation of names will have to excuse me for saying names the anglicised way. So we've always been Aegis rather than Ajus in England, and I'll say Muscat rather than Muscar, and Samut rather than Samut. Of course, Malta being Malta, with such a small population, my two sets of cousins are very much intertwined, and if not connected by DNA or marriage, they've all known each other in the same social circles for generations, with many who are just long-time family friends going back 100 years. So I'll show you this small part of the family as an example to introduce my two Maltese great-grandfathers, Edward Tancred Aegis and Achilles Samut, and to bring it closer to home by placing our Zoom host, David Vassallo, right in the middle there. So coming down the left-hand side, we see descended from Edward. There's my second cousin, Jackie Rigo, married to Stephen, and I think they're here with us this evening. And on the right-hand side, descended from Achilles, their second cousin, Joanna Zamit Kutaya, married to Joseph. And in the middle, there's Peter, who was with us last time. I'm not sure he's with us this evening. And Louis, David's father. Son of Jackie, and Jack is Mark, who is also here with us this evening. And he's my main point of reference for the cousins living in Malta, if I want to get him to look up ending for me in the Malta archives. And I have an extra connection to Mark in that we were at the same school and house downside in Somerset, but 13 years apart. And I believe he has an old school friend with him this evening, who, and we were all in the same house, a bit different years apart. And I put on the old school tie, especially for him this evening. So on that note, Judy welcome Stephen and Mark and Jackie to here with us this evening. So my story centres on Edward Tancred Aegis, fondly referred to in the family as ETA. I will detail his life going backwards and forwards and sideways and show how he was as significant in terms of the representation of Malta in England 100 years ago, and why we came to be known by family and friends in Malta as the London Aegises. So coming back to the group photo I showed on my title slide, this is the golden wedding party for ETA and Madame Concetta at the big family home, 3 Belsize Grove in Hampstead in January 1923. So here we have a collection of uncles, aunts, and who were in England at the time. And if you can follow my cursor on the screen, I'll pick out some of the key characters. So the tall boy in the middle here is my father, age 11, dressed in a white outfit, but he was still unhappy with when I videoed him talking about his life 80 years later. He was the 3rd Edward Tancred Aegis and was always very proud to have that name. His siblings there are all in white. So we have Joseph, who later became Dom Dennis of Downside Abbey, Sue, who gathered the great archive that I've inherited, Mary, and the toddler sitting on ETA's lap is my Uncle Richard. On the side here, we have my grandparents, Joseph Aegis, married to Margaret, known as Maggie Samut. Behind her is Uncle Arthur, who I'll come back to when I talk about World War I. Then the back row here, we have Harold Cassar. He was the first Maltese Rhodes Scholar to Oxford. He was at Exeter College, Oxford, as was great Uncle Alfred over here. And I followed in their footsteps to Exeter College 50 years ago in 1971. Tancred in the middle here became the 2nd Dom Ambrose Aegis, and he was another monk of Downside Abbey and later transferred to Ealing Abbey, where he dies and is buried in the grounds at Ealing Abbey. Here is Mari Denaro, who wrote the family history that David Arrigo published. And she was married to Frank Denaro and living in Malta, but she was a frequent visitor to see the family in London all her life. Her youngest son in the front here is Arthur, who was at Downside Junior School at this time. He was killed in action in Holland in 1944, not long after Operation Market Garden. And another back row here, we have his elder brothers, twins, Wilfred and George Denaro. They had been at Downside School during the war years and had to negotiate the difficult journey from Malta to the south of France, avoiding being torpedoed by German submarines. On the left, we have Charles Muscat, nephew of Maria Concetta and grandfather of Anne, who's here with us this evening. And I'll be talking about Anne's great-grandfather Joseph and great-aunt Mary later. And then the other boy on the right here is Tony Cassar, brother of Harold, who was at another Benedictine school, Dowie, near Reading. In the Second World War, he started the business Cassar and Cooper with his friend, and they were famous for forming Malta's first ever aircraft operating company, British Air Services, which later became Air Malta Limited. And finally, there's here on the side is Aunt Daisy. Now, she moved to Seymour with her mother in 1951 as the family downsized, and my grandparents and family moved out to Edgware. She became a famously matriarchal figure in Malta from 1931 to 1971, and she was known to all as Aunt Daisy, to family and non-family alike. ETA had encouraged his daughters to marry Maltese and settle in Malta. There were Cassar, Denaro, Arrigo, and Montpellier de Piero. And so by 1923, a large part of the family were proper Maltese living in Malta, and accordingly, they had a golden wedding celebration part 2 later that year in the Osborne Hotel in Valletta. And here's a photo to mark that occasion. And apart from the parents, there's Aunt Daisy and Maridino, both ends of the chain, so that they managed to get to both parties. So to understand how the family, ETA in particular, became so influential in Maltese affairs in London, we need to roll back a couple of generations to see where he came from. So this chart shows my line back to ETA, and then his father Tancred, and his grandfather Pietro Paolo. And here's a small portrait of Pietro Paolo, given by David Arrigo for helping him collate material for the Daughter of an Empire book. In A Ramble in Malta and Sicily in the autumn of 1841 by George French Angas, published in 1842, we read that on arriving in Malta in 1841, he first stopped at the store of Pietro Paolo Aegis to send a letter back to England to say he'd arrived safely. And then later at the beginning of chapter 3, he tells how he had a pleasant walk in the country with to see Mr. Aegis's villa farm, accompanied by his 2 sons, Antonio and Tancredi. So that Tancredi is my great-great-grandfather. And it says how they left by the Marina Gate and walked along the shore of the Grand Harbour to Massa, and then on to find a farm in Pieta. We haven't actually identified, so this is the old Marina Gate, which was replaced in the 1880s by the Victoria Gate, which is still there today. And I'm sure many of you will have been there and recognise it. So this would have been a walk out in the country back in those days, of course. It's all built up now, but so basically their path would have taken them along the front here, around past Massa and back round to Pieta. We haven't quite identified where this farm would have been, but it's somewhere in that area. So we know that Tancred then moved to Alexandria shortly after, because ETA was born there and baptized in the church of St. Catherine of Alexandria in Alexandria. And we know that Tancred was in huntery and supplies business because cousin Marcus discovered this invoice in the Queen's Gallery collection a few years ago. And you'll see it's an invoice for supplying the royal yacht when it was on the Prince of Wales tour of the Empire in 1862. And it tells on here of the business of Joseph Sammet, late Tancred Aegis, ship's chandler and general commission agent. Now, Tancred Aegis was actually married to a Severia Sammet, so you think there's probably a family connection there, passing on the business to within the family. Tancred did very well in Alexandria, and one story passed down the family is that he bought grain and corn in the Sudan and had it shipped out to supply the troops in the Crimean War. Sadly, he died relatively young, aged 42. But he was respected enough to be buried under one of the fine marble gravestones in Paul's Shipwreck Church in Valletta. And this rare postcard, which they don't seem to sell anymore, but we found it on our visit in 1982, shows the floor uncovered by the usual chairs and highlights his position near the front of the nave. This is the close-up of his gravestone, which says Tancredo Aegis, and there's the decode of it on the side, the dedication from his wife, Severi. I've inherited a very large portrait of him, which hangs on our stairs, and so we pass by him several times a day at the top of our stairs. So I'm always acknowledging my ancestors every day as I walk around the house. His wife, Syria, outlived him by 47 years, and she died in 1919 and is buried in the Aegis chapel at Adolorata Cemetery, which a chapel built shortly after the cemetery was opened in the 1870s. She lived in the large house on the Piazzetta Tower Road steamer, that is now a high-rise with just the facade preserved. And there's mixed views on this new build. I'm slowly warming to the design of the new building when compared to the other high-rise blocks that surround it. And that's not just because the developer behind it is a third cousin to me. So returning to ETA, he finished his education in Paris in 1866, and in 1868, presumably after discussing it with his father, he decided to make his way in the City of London in coal shipping. Father and son had become aware of the Suez Canal under construction, which was finally opened in 1869, and he predicted that this would lead to a great increase in shipping through the Mediterranean and consequent need for fueling stop in Malta. So ever with an eye for the next opportunity, he determined that it would be a good idea to set up in business in London and ship coal from Wales and Yorkshire all around the world, and especially to the Mediterranean and Malta. So at the same time, the parents determined that his younger brother, Alfred, should have an English education. And so it was that Edward and Alfred arrived in England in September 1868, the first Aegis to settle in England. Edward left Alfred with the Benedictine monks at St. Augustine's Abbey and School in Ramsgate and set off for the city aged 19. And we have in our archive his admission card there on the left to the Baltic Exchange in Threadneedle Street, dated September 1868. And then on the right-hand side, we see his formal admittance as a member, dated 1st of April, 1869. And that's why we can say we've been in London for 150 years. Quite what the city gents thought of this 20-year-old Maltese entrepreneur is anybody's guess, but it's likely that's when Aegis changed to Aegis. His father Tancred died in 1872, and Edward became head of the family. So while sorting affairs in Malta, he met and fell in love with Maria Concetta Muscat, who was a good friend of his sister Julia, who was still then in Malta with his mother Severia. She was the daughter of Carlo Maria Muscat, a significant member of the banking community in Valletta. He was a member of the elected government council in the 1860s and later president of the Chamber of Commerce. And this fine portrait hangs in their gallery of past presidents. He owned and lived in the big house on Republic Street, then called Strada Reale. It is now the La Vallette Club. So Edward and Maria married in January 1873 in the church commonly known as St. Catherine of Italy, but more properly St. Catherine of Alexandria, which is just by the Castile Square. And I always think that's quite appropriate for where he was born and baptized, actually in St. Catherine of Alexandria in Alexandria. So they had a big reception in the Muscat family home on Strada Reale. And then ETA took his bride back to Chiswick to start his married life. And he's basically stayed in London for the rest of his life, but with frequent visits to Malta for the next 50 years. So they soon moved to Hampstead and started to make their way in the city, as well as in the Catholic social circles of Hampstead and beyond. So first partnership with others, he then set up Ed T. Aegis Limited, coal shipping in Lime Street, with offices all around the world. Most famously, he photoed Lascaris Wharf, the Custom House, or the Baraka Lift between 1895 and 1930, shows the company name on the building there. And in this photo of the arrival of Edward VII at the Custom House in 1903, I like to think there's some family balcony there looking on the scene below. So all this time, so what had become of his brother Alfred while ETA was growing the business? But after leaving school in Ramsgate, he joined the monastery and became Dom Ambrose Aegis of St. Augustine's. In 1893, he was appointed secretary to the Procurator of the Subiaco Congregation of Benedictines by Pope Leo XIII, and continued to make a name for himself in Rome. In 1904, Pope Pius X made Ambrose his apostolic delegate in the Philippines, at the same time consecrating him as titular Archbishop of Palmyra. Ambrose then settled in Manila, stopping to have a tour of USA, which included a dinner with President Theodore Roosevelt to discuss the Philippine affairs while on his way out to the Philippines from London. So at the same time, with this connection to the Holy See, ETA was made a lay chamberlain of. So this is the photo of the Ambrose's consecration as Archbishop in the Church of Santa Maggiore in Rome, and here he is with his mother Severia to the left and ETA on the far left, and on the right hand side of the photo there's his sister Julia and his younger brother Edgar. So this is Ambrose in his Archbishop's regalia in the Philippines. So as I say, ETA was made a lay chamberlain of the Sword and Cape in 2004 at the same time, a job which involved waiting on the Pope for 1 week a year, and this only added to his reputation in London. So we know what colour this uniform was because I actually have it in my possession, including the sword, and knowing the colours, Richard Steddle, who will talk to us later, very kindly coloured in the photo for us. So that's probably quite a good representation of how he would look. Well, I tend to think he probably would have darker hair than that, but the uniform is the right colour. So I have what we call the papal sword, and this gets pulled out for all weddings, christenings, and big family, big birthday parties where we have a cake to cut. So we start to brandish the papal sword around, much to everyone's amusement. So that's my wedding in 1977 and my daughter's wedding in 2012. So he became a spokesman and representative for the Maltese government in London. And number 3, Sides Grove, which you can see here, became open house on the Sunday afternoon for any Maltese visiting London, not only to check out eligible suitors for his daughter, but also to keep tabs on the politics and business affairs between Malta and London. He and Maria spent months of the year in Malta, leaving the boys at the bottom of the family in the care of nannies or the elder sisters still in London, or the monks at Downside School. In the years before World War I, Edward continued to try out different ventures in addition to the coal shipping. One was in oil distribution with St. Paul Petroleum Tanks Limited. We have yet to establish exact locations where, but it seems the tanks were based on the Corridor Wharfs opposite Marsa and also on Manuel Island. But he had to sell his major interest in oil under pressure from Esso and Rockefeller in America. Another short-lived enterprise was his introduction of the first buses in Malta in 1904. Sorry, I was just so yeah, this is the part of his reputation in as being representative of Malta in London. He was one of the Malta representatives at the coronation of George V in 1910, and this is a photo of him with Oreste Grek Mifsud and Edward Sabornier assembled just before the coronation in 1910. And this is we also have his official invite to the coronation. This is quite a document. It's actually about 1 foot by 1.5 feet and came in a very large envelope back in 1910. And I have that in my possession. So coming back to the buses then, so Commercial Motor Magazine in 1904 and 1905 tells us how the business came about. Now ETA arranged to have buses you see here shipped out from Thornycross in England. He worked with his brother-in-law Joseph Muscat, who looked after the Malta end of the operation. And Joseph is seen here on the top deck and he is father of Charles, who is in our golden wedding photo, and great-grandfather of Anne, who's here with us this evening. And at this point, I'll quickly introduce Richard Steadall, who's an Englishman working in Malta on the Memoria project with the National Archives, special reference to the buses. So he was aware of the names behind the first buses, but not the detail of their lives, especially ETA, until we first came across it a few years ago. And he's very kindly given full credit to ETA and Joseph Muscat in exhibitions, online videos, and radio interviews. And I shall ask him to give us a brief word about the Memoria project and the Malta Bus Archive at the end of my talk. So for various reasons, first buses didn't last more than a year or so, but ETA still managed to keep up his high profile lifestyle. And he's also noted, so he's representative of Malta on several occasions, and particularly he is representative of the government at the Jutland Memorial Service in Westminster Cathedral in 1916. So in the years before World War I, Edward was content to see the business thrive and look after his growing family in London and Malta. Edward and Maria had 15 children in the 22 years, 1874 to 1896, 6 girls and 9 boys. And it so happened that 5 of the girls were in the top half and 5 of the boys were numbers 11 to 15. And I'll have more to say about the 5 boys in a moment. The 3 boys in the top half died young. Charles in infancy, Jack tragically fell down an unguarded lift shaft in Glasgow, aged 7, and the second Edward Tancred Aegis, married in 1900 but died 4 years later, aged 29. And so it was that my grandfather, Joseph, at number 9 in the pecking order, became the eldest living son and set to take on the business in due course. As I said, his elder sisters were encouraged to marry Maltese and settle in Malta, and in 1900, the first grandchild, Vera Cassar, was born in Malta. The Cassar, Arrigo and Taro families started to grow in Malta, while the 5 boys at the bottom end were still at Downside School. In 1909, my grandfather, Joseph, went to Malta to visit his sisters, where he met Maggie Summit and immediately telegrammed ETA asking for permission to marry Miss Summit. He was ordered home forthwith, but after due consideration and some negotiation with Maggie's father, Achilles Summit, he was allowed to return to Malta in the autumn to marry Maggie in St. Patrick's steamer. This wasn't totally out of the blue because ETA and Achilles had met many times in London, while Achilles was serving with the Army Ordnance Corps at various locations around England, but especially at Woolwich Arsenal. And we know that Achilles and his wife Enrichetta Tagliaferro were at several wedding party in 1898. By happy chance, Archbishop Ambrose was making his only trip to Europe in the summer of 1909 to discuss church affairs with Pope Pius and to see family in Malta and London. So the wedding was timed to coincide with his visit, and my parents had the honour of being married by an archbishop, Joseph's uncle. So Archbishop, bride and groom then travelled to London, where they had the celebrations at the Grove, and Joseph and Maggie set up home in Downside Crescent, Hampstead, not far from Belsize Grove, if you're familiar with Hampstead, where my father and 4 siblings were born. And living in Downside Crescent was more than a coincidence of names, because the architect of the houses on the Crescent was an old boy at Downside School, and he designed much of the newly built Downside Abbey in Somerset. So ETA would often go to St. Dominic's on horseback, and it took him, that's another photo of my grandparents' wedding with Aunt Daisy and Maggie Seri as bridesmaid, and first cousin to my grandfather, Joseph Louis Muscat, his best man. Another group photo of the wedding. So coming back to, so ETA would go to St. Dominic's on horseback, and his route took him along Downside Crescent. And here's one occasion when he used to give my father a ride on his way back from Mass one Sunday morning. So these are the houses in Downside Crescent, which you can still see to this day. So moving on to ETA's final years, he had lined up his youngest sons, Alfred, Arthur and Edgar, to take on various parts of the business, but as with all families, life was totally disrupted by the outbreak of World War I. The 5 youngest all served in the war, and I'll come back to their story briefly when I've laid ETA to rest. ETA had money tied up in Germany and Austria, and then the Royal Navy changed from coal-fired ships to oil-fired, and the trade in coal shipping started to dry up in the 1920s. In hindsight then, it was good that ETA departed this life on the high spot of his involvement with the Malta Pavilion at the British Empire exhibition at Wembley in 1924. He masterminded the construction of the pavilion in association with a committee back in Malta, which included his nephew, by his in-laws, who was Ugo Mifsud, who later became Sir Ugo Mifsud, the youngest Prime Minister of Malta. And I've gathered every snippet of info I can find about the pavilion on the webpage on my family website. And if you Google Empire Exhibition Malta, you will be taken straight there. So here are some unique photos showing ETA actually inside the pavilion and leaving it. And there's Daisy and Wilfred Denaro and an unknown behind him there on the photo on the right. So Major Albert Abela, in his book, A Nation's Praise, Malta, People, Places and Events, Historical Sketches, writes, Lord Grenfell, a former governor of Malta, then in his 84th year, was largely instrumental in promoting the Malta Pavilion. It was described by the Daily Malta Chronicle of January 28, 1925, as one of Malta's tiny geniuses at Wembley. It was Grenfell who had laid the foundation stone of the Malta Pavilion, and Dr., later Sir Ugo Mifsud, was local chairman of the Special Exhibition Committee, while Edward Tancredagius, president of the Malta Association in London, was appointed commissioner for Malta at the exhibition. The Malta Pavilion had its own garden with neat paths and flower beds and benches, interspersed with kiosks selling lace and other Maltese products, quite apart from traditional Maltese refreshments. The overall effect of the magnificent pavilion and its well laid out garden was to turn that cherished spot at Wembley into a little Malta. In May, the pavilion was visited by King George and Queen Mary with Queen Anna of Italy. And you see here the Queen's being presented with bouquets by my aunts Mary and Sue. Sadly, ETA became terminally ill during the months of the exhibition and died in September. And after the funeral in St. Dominic's, Hampstead, they had a memorial mass in the small oratory that ETA had arranged to be constructed just across the way from the pavilion. And all the family in London at the time were present at that occasion. And as I say on my Malta Pavilion webpage, he was ever the promoter of all things Maltese from the moment he arrived in London in 1869 to his passing in 1924, and leaves behind a diverse legacy of over 400 descendants spread all around the world, mainly in England and Malta. Moving on then, just very briefly to wrap up, before I talk about the great uncles and cousins in World War I, I'll introduce my other Maltese great grandfather, Achilles Sammet. He and his brothers were all in the military, either the British Army or the King's Own Malta Regiment. Achilles was in the Army Ordnance Corps. And in the 1890s, just quickly, I should say, he was married to Enrichetta, the great tribe of Tagliaferro, who had connections to Biagio Tagliaferro, who was one of the first bankers in Valletta back in the 1830s. And but basically all the Tagliaferros I've come across in my researches in Malta are DNA connected to me. And I welcome here this evening John Sammet Tagliaferro, who's on that Tagliaferro tree, and has given me helped me to fill in lots of gaps in recent weeks and months as we connect to our Sammet and Tagliaferro with his Sammet and Tagliaferros. So to bring it more locally closer to home, in the 1890s, Achilles was commanding officer of Tipner Barracks at the end of Portsea Island that has Portsmouth and Southsea. And my aunt Lena is noted on her birth certificates as being born at Tipner House, the commanding officer residence next to the barracks. And this is an old aerial photo I managed to find of the house, the commanding officer's house on the barracks. This now lies under the M275 extension down to Portsmouth. It was demolished just after the Second World War. The next child, Uncle Lenny, was born in the house they had in Southsea. Achilles was then commanding officer at Woolwich Arsenal, where the last child, Uncle Frank, was born. In 1905, he retired to Sleamer, where they lived on the house on Tower Road opposite the Fortizza house on the end here. That's where my grandmother was married from. And he named it Southsea House after his time in Southsea, Hampshire. And although the original house is long gone, it's pleasing to see that the apartment block that's still there is still called Southsea House. And I don't suppose the residents who live there know why it's called that. And there's another house in Sleamer side street that's belonged to Achilles that is still called Tipner House. Achilles volunteered to serve again in World War I, and after a time as newspaper censor in Malta, he did more duty in England. On his second retirement and journey back to Malta in September 1918, he was on a ship that was torpedoed in the Bay of Biscay that sank within 4 minutes. Yet most of the crew and passengers survived in lifeboats in high seas overnight before being picked up by the USS Talbot. And until 2014, all we knew was the name of the rescue ship. But with the free help of the US Naval Archive, who sent me the log of the Talbot for those days, I've not only been able to identify the name of the ship that was lost, SS Tasman, the location, marked on this map here, the number of the German submarine, and the list of all the survivors, but also covered the detailed diary of a missionary who was on board, traveling to Asia via the Suez Canal. So these are photos of the Tasman, which was lost, and the US naval boat which rescued them. And this is a photo in the background here is Achilles shortly after being rescued, looking rather bewildered in the back row there. So once back in Malta, Achilles turned to politics and was elected as a senator in the 1921 Constitution, the first try at self-government for Malta. In 1926, he went to Australia as Malta's delegate to the Empire Parliamentary Association meeting. And at this point, I did mean to put in a photo of him laying a wreath at the Anzac Memorial in Sydney, but I forgot to do that, I see. So in 1927, re-elected to the Senate and also the legislature chamber, which is the equivalent of our House of Commons. And he became Treasury Minister in Sir Gerald Strickland's government, but resigned on a point of principle in 1929, when Strickland started his showdown with Bishop Maurice Caruana that finally led to the suspension of self-government. That was all to do with the balance of church and state in the country's affairs. One of my special interests is Maltese politics between the wars, and I could perhaps give a talk on that on another occasion. Incidentally, Bishop Caruana was a Benedictine monk of Fort Augustus in Scotland and was briefly secretary to Archbishop Ambrose in Manila in 1905. So wheels within wheels again. And so there were representatives from Manila at his consecration as Bishop of Malta in 1915. In the next generation then, ETA had 5 sons and Achilles had 4 sons who all went to war. They served with distinction on the Western Front and Gallipoli. And I could fill another evening about Malta in World War I to complement David's fascinating Malta Nurse of the Mediterranean talk that he gave us a few years ago. And you can read the full story of Great Uncles in World War I on our website. So for the Armistice Centenary, I posted this special page on our website and to Facebook to commemorate those who served that I'm connected to in any way. During the course of the centenary, we walked the cousin through the war day by day through the eyes of a marvellous archive of letters sent by Uncle Arthur to his fiancée and later wife, posting to Facebook and to our website. Arthur has also left a significant archive with the Imperial War Museum, and we were thrilled that he was mentioned by name at the Somme Memorial Service in 2016.
Florence Scarlett's husband, Second Lieutenant Harold Ernest Scarlett of the London Regiment Royal Fusiliers, was killed on the 17th of September. She wrote a letter of thanks to Captain Arthur Agius, who had informed her of her husband's death. Florence and Harold's granddaughter, Claire, reads that letter.
Dear Captain Aegis, I wish to take this opportunity to thank you.
So after that, I did actually get in touch with that granddaughter, and she told me she made a special effort to say Aegis the way Arthur would have said. We're also very proud of the fact that in A.E. Avila's book, Malta's George Cross and War Gallantry Awards, all the great uncles who earned MCs in the First World War are mentioned. And so, although they're not strictly Maltese, being born and bred in London and only ever visiting Malta for a few months of their lives, we're very proud of the fact that they are listed here. So of the 9 awards given in World War I to those I'm directly related to. So there's great uncle Alfred there, a cousin Alfred Gatt, Charles Muscat, who's Anne's grandfather, first cousin to my grandfather, Uncle Arthur, and Uncle Arthur Samet. And then William Parnis is another Samet cousin to my grandmother. And down there's other Aegis who I haven't connected to yet, but I think there is some connection somewhere. So Arthur and Alfred were in the 1/3 London Regiment, and by happy chance were stationed in Malta at the Mtarfa Barracks, September 1914 to January 1915. And on their days off, they would ride down to Slima on horseback to see their sisters and young nephews and nieces. And this is a photo of the officers gathered in the officers' quarters at Mtarfa Barracks. And in the middle here, there's Uncle Alfred there, and on this side, Uncle Arthur. So in 1915, they were moved to the Western Front, where their first action was the Battle for Neuve-Chapelle. Meanwhile, the youngest of the family, Richard, was in the 2/3 Londons and trod a slightly different path. In Malta in 1915, then Khartoum and Gallipoli at the end of 1915, where he survived the horrific storm which virtually decimated the 2/3 Londons. Having survived all that, he was killed in action at Pol Capel during the battle for Passchendaele, just northeast of Ypres. At this point, let's give a welcome to Nick Fear, who I see here in the audience, who I met when he was a guide on battlefield tour in 2013. And he very kindly took the tour bus to the field where Richard lies buried, but as yet undiscovered, so that we could have a moment by the field before finding his name on the Tyne-Cot Memorial. A couple of years later, and after I'd met up with Liz Mardell, who I think was due to be with us, but I'm not sure if she's arrived yet, long-time member of Friends of Valletta, and here I hope this evening, I discovered that Liz had taught Nick at RN Badala in the 1950s. So again, connections and wheels within wheels again. Another happy outcome of our World War I research was getting to know third cousin Anne Muscat, descended from Joseph Muscat of the buses. Anne and her father John have inherited an amazing photo album made by Joseph's daughter Mary Muscat when she was nursing in Malta in World War I at Cotonera, and mainly it's the temporary tented hospital of St Patrick's, which is now buried under new developments in St Guan. They've kindly allowed me to post the whole album to our website, and again, if you Google Mary Muscat World War I, it will show at the top of the page and take you straight there. So just coming back to finishing off with great Uncle Richard, who was killed at Pol Capel. This is his name on the Tyne-Cot Memorial. And in October 2017, after getting so much interest in the family with our World War I blogging, we decided to have a grand reunion at Downside. And this is the gathering of the clan of Aegis and Muscat on a day, October 2017. And there's Mark Vassallo was there, and Stephen and Jackie, and Nina, and her brother, Father Christopher Calashoni, is there in the front. So there are, of the 150 guests, we have over 100 blood-related cousins all gathered on that day, which was quite an incredible occasion. So just to show you. So, and then coming back to Mary Muscat, she, as I say, she features on our website. And if you care to Google her, you'll find her quite easily. So just finishing off quite rapidly now, as time marches on. So the nursing thread was carried on by my aunt's marriages in World War II. My grandmother's sisters stayed in Malta, married and became Mary Ferro, Maud Policino, and Lena Gatt. And after she and her cousins were in London for the coronation of George VI in 1937, they took Mary back to Malta with them as a sort of finishing school experience. Mary found herself stuck in Malta at the outbreak of war, and so decided to sign up as a VAD. And she then found herself nursing at Montafa with her cousins Margaret Ferro, Cella Arrigo, Inez Vetz, and Geraldine Montpellier de Piero. And here they are lining up for some sort of inspection, and various photos around the nurses' quarters in Montafa. At the end of the war, she joined the army proper and became a nurse in the Queen Alexandra Royal Army Nursing Corps, or Quaranks. So just very quick, I need to finish off with two very quick stories. So one of my interesting ancestors is tied to Giuseppe Cohen, who is the man who foiled to assassinate Grandmaster Pinto in 1749. Now he's, so Carla Maria Muscat was married to Giuseppe Cohen, and she has a direct line back to this chap, who is therefore my sixth great-grandfather. He overheard a conspiracy in his coffee shop in Christopher Street, across the way from the slave prison in Old Valletta. And he reported to Grandmaster Pinto, and they were all put in prison. He got a great reward. At first, he was given a house in Merchant Street, which he later converted to an annuity. And on that house, there was this grand plaque which tells the story of Giuseppe Cohen and his role in foiling the plot on Grandmaster Pinto. This plaque was taken down when the house, the ownership of the house was converted to annuity in about 40 years later, and the plaque was taken down and lay in a basement for many years. It was then recovered, and it was being found again quite recently in the National Museum in Valletta. It's still in the basement, and one of my missions is to try and get it displayed properly with the story of the slave conspiracy. One recently discovered cousin on the Cohen side. So on the house in Merchant Street, which is now the Monte di Pieta, you see an outline of where the plaque was. So my cousin, newly discovered Cohen cousin Carolina, when she was in Malta a couple of years ago, took these photos of the plaque with her mother there on the side, Joan, and then we tried to read, and then by getting access to the minister's office across the road, she managed to get this good shot of the Monte di Pieta, and then we superimposed the plaque on top of it to get a view of how it might have looked, 300 years ago. So on the Cohen story, there was a legacy passed down the family, but now that there are probably about 1,500 descendants of Giuseppe Cohen, it's now worthless. But our father, John Muscat, did try to see what was left in the kitty a few years ago, and found after a day of form filling, he found he had enough money to buy an ice cream, I believe. But just for interest's sake, he looked to see what was left in the kitty. So finishing now with my other famous ancestral connection. Achilles' brother was Robert Summit, who is famous for composing the music to the Maltese national anthem. Now, he was a medical army medic, doctor, and famously led the doctors team from Malta to help out after the Messina earthquake in 1908. and he's marked in several ways in Floriana, where he was born and bred, and on the house in his cousin, the house where he was born, Castiglione, has a plaque on the side marking his involvement with the writing of the music for the national anthem. And the old Wesleyan Methodist Church in Floriana is now the Robert Samut Concert Hall in his honour. And on that note, I shall finish with a resounding, with children of Malta singing the Maltese national anthem, which I'm sure you know starts with the words El Din El Alt Helwa, which gets us back to our charity for tonight, where we're donating half our funds tonight to their work. So without further ado, I shall step on to just to finish off, David will tell you that he has a connection to Duncalm, who wrote the words of the national anthem.
You're absolutely right, Peter. Duncalm Saila, my great-grandfather's uncle. Well, anyway, Stephen can correct me exactly on that one. My grandfather's uncle, that's him. Peter, congratulations. What a tremendous tour. Graham Pound, over to you.
Peter, excellent. Thank you so much. I'm sure that there's going to be quite a few questions. So can I say thank you? It was excellent. The number of stories you had to tell us was quite remarkable. So are there any questions?
Where are you?
Yes, Richard.
Hello there. Welcome to a very old house in Rabat. Just a very quick one to say, obviously, thank you to Peter for helping with the research into his family's bus operations, which were the very first buses to operate in Malta. If you want to find out more about that, if you go onto YouTube and search for the Malta Bus Archive, the channel there, I've done a couple of videos, one last year, which was about 40 minutes long, looking not only at the vehicles, but the people as well. And then a couple of weeks ago, I was on Campus FM, the community radio studio run out of the university here in Malta. And my second session on that show was again talking primarily about ETA's buses and ETA. But if there's anybody that has got connections with, sort of family connections or anything with the the Maltese bus industry, by all means do get in touch. If you would like me to do a talk at some point in the future about Malta's bus history and the social side of it and some of the families that were involved in the early days and bits and pieces, I'm more than happy to do that. One final thing is my day job with the Malta Bus Archives. I work at the National Archives headquarters here in Rabat. One of the things that we hold are the original passport application forms that were filled in whenever people here had passports. From 1916 onwards, they include normally a photograph of the applicant. So if you are aware of an ancestor who, after 1916, applied for a passport, let me know, because I can probably dig out the original document and do you a high quality scan of the application form and of the photograph. Currently, they're indexed online up until 1939, and then from 1939 up to about 1950, 1951, they're available, but I have to go through the manual indexes. At the moment, there's a 70-year closure period on those, so anything from sort of 52 onwards is currently closed to the public. But again, I'm more than happy to help anybody who maybe wants to do some family research and is looking for the passport applications and bits and pieces.
Richard.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you. There's already been a couple of comments straight away on the chat button saying it would love a talk from yourself in due course.
Yeah.
We do have
From